tight as we try to bring something from the in-person realm to the virtual realm. So thanks for your patience with technology as we all adapt. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jesse Haskins, who's the founder and principal at J. Haskins Law, who's gonna share with us how to think about community-supported agriculture customers as investors. So Jesse, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful introduction. I am an attorney. I do not have any experience farming, but I do have a lot of experience eating. I really love food, and that's what brings me here today, and has what really driven my passion for local food systems and community-supported agriculture in particular. So that's a brief background of me. I want to get to know you a little bit more. So if you don't mind answering that poll, and I'll publish the results in a moment. But for now, I'll say, as an avid foodie, I want to invest in local agriculture. I want my fellow foodies and I to be able to partner with food entrepreneurs like you, to not only enjoy community produced food today, but to ensure that it will be around tomorrow. To make sure that good food has a good future, we want to invest as a community. When we come together as a community, we all benefit from stronger local food systems. That is what community-supported agriculture is about. Community-supported agriculture represents an opportunity to engage consumers as investors in food. It seems like most of you have a background in fresh produce, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And I have one more question, and I'm also going to focus on address everyone else's backgrounds in prepared foods and such. I have one more survey question. And for this, as I use survey questions for the first time, please excuse the delay. I'm going to cover this later and revisit it. I will share the results later in my presentation. But for now, just to provide a brief overview, I'm going to be focusing on 3 ways to cultivate community investors: education, written agreements, and business entities. When I'm talking about investments, I really have 4 aspects in mind: the investment, the risk, reward, and the benefits for the business. The investment is just the money going in. So when we think about traditional investment, when we think, for example, about the stock market, you're putting in money to buy a share of stock, a part of the company, essentially. When we're talking about community supporting agriculture, community members buy a share of the community supported agriculture. They are actually buying into and investing what yield is going to look like later that season or later that year. So with that investment comes the risk that they're not going to see a return. That's part of the nature of investment. Again, to compare it to the traditional stock market, there's a risk you put in money in your favorite stock and you're not going to see anything. You're going to be out that amount of money you put in. And there's a similar risk, a comparable risk, with community supported agriculture, that a community member, a community eater, puts in money to buy a share, but because of some unanticipated crop failure or some other unanticipated economic event, the entire community is going to be sharing loss with the farmer. But that is what really helps empower local food systems as a whole. Without community-supported agriculture, it's really the proprietor, the grower, the person who prepares jams that is bearing the entire risk of some unforeseen, devastating economic event. But with community-supported agriculture, everyone comes together and shares that risk. And this goes into that third aspect. Everyone also shares in the rewards. In a normal year, of course, there are going to be normal levels of crop yields. And as a reward for the community members taking that risk, they're getting a good deal on that product. They are getting more produce than they would normally get if they were to go into the general type of consumer guarantee, no obligation transaction. The discount is the reward in community-supported agriculture. And that's just in a normal year. When we're talking about bumper crops, where there's actually an unanticipated bounty, basically the opposite of crop failure, the community investors, again, should get rewarded for that. They should get more food essentially for themselves, for their family. When we're not worrying about a pandemic, maybe they can invite their friends as guests and share in that additional cornucopia with them. There's also potentially the option at the food entrepreneur's discretion to offer some type of buyback program where the consumer would have the ability to, at a nominal price, to sell back the surplus crop back to the grower, back to the farmer, a food entrepreneur. So that could be resold in some other marketing channel like a farmer's market. Those are just the short-term rewards. Community members may also be motivated by more long-term motivations, making sure that local food systems stay strong so that there is a place to go back to year after year, that it is economically sustainable for the business and therefore also sustainable for the entire community as a whole. This is somewhat more social, somewhat more ethical perhaps, but this too has an analog in the traditional stock market model. It's referred to as social investing, where investment decisions are driven, at least in part, by social and ethical considerations. Those are the benefits, the rewards for the investor. There are also, of course, rewards for the food entrepreneur. One of them I've already mentioned, and that is the opportunity to offload risk that would traditionally be borne entirely by the business. The other, to launch into the presentation slide part, as I attempt to get this up. Bear with me for one moment, please. The other part is what motivates a lot of businesses, and that is the ability to get an infusion of capital. This benefit is clear from a 2001 survey that asked CSA farms how much community-supported agriculture contributed to the operation of the farm. Survey responses ranged from greatly undermined, which is shown here in dark red, to undermined in pink, no change in orange, improved in light green, and greatly improved in dark green. So we can see, for example, that nearly 3/4 of farms found that CSAs infuse them with enough capital to meet their annual operating costs. And over half of CSA farms found that the CSA helped food entrepreneurs with their own compensation. More CSA farms found that CSAs helped them build and maintain infrastructure compared to those that found CSAs were actually detrimental. the last benefit from the business perspective I'm going to cover is community engagement. And this is a big one. I want to make sure actually that everyone can see the slides all right. I think everyone should, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. The overwhelming majority of farms surveyed found that this helped with community engagement. And this is important because it means a greater opportunity to cultivate a core group of investors. These are the people who are not only willing to make that upfront investment I mentioned earlier, but they're actually enthusiastic and excited about doing more, about contributing their time, about contributing their expertise to help the entire operation. And we see that CSAs with this core group, they actually see more in terms of their bottom line. They actually get a median of $10,000 more in CSA income when they have a core group compared to when they do not have a core group. And this is because core groups contribute more. They contribute more to social programming, to educational programming, to increasing accessibility to low-income households. The idea that local farms and eaters should depend on each other, help each other, and invest in each other is nothing new. It is actually the historical default. It used to be, before we had no interstate transportation, the community farm was the only show in town. There was no industrial agriculture alternative. But that started to change when the US numbered highway system took off in the 1920s. And that's around the period of time we see a rise in faceless agriculture. The number of farms declined, the size of farms grew, community farming went into decline. But out of concerns of the use of pesticides, genetically modified organisms, we start to see pushback against this, at least in Japan around the 60s and 70s with the Seikyo Teikei movement. This movement, Teikei, actually translates into contract. And the goal of this movement was to put the farmer's face back on vegetables, as you can see in the on the back of a modernized Teikei truck. The movement is actually focused and consists of 10 principles, but in the interest of time, I am just going to talk about the 3 that really show how American-style community-supported agriculture programs can manage risks. And first is the principle of mutual assistance, having a shared understanding of each other's needs and desires, where community members, eaters, and producers really understand each other's perspectives and where the other is coming from. Second, a principle of accepting the produce. That customers accept produce grown based on previous consultations between farmers and growers. And finally, a principle of mutual concession. A full disclosure of the true costs and benefits of CSAs for both the producer and consumer when establishing the price of a CSA share. So people's motivations for joining, the leading motivation is obtaining access to fresh, nutritious produce, and this is flash forward to the US, followed by buying local produce, supporting small-scale farms, obtaining a source of local produce, toward the bottom, caring for the environment, and further at the bottom is pretty much building community and a desire to learn about agriculture. Now, the reason I had that poll is I wanted to compare it to the consumer responses given. And is everyone able to see the poll results? So, and I'm sorry, let me actually try to pull up. I can't see I can't see if anyone is chatting. So just if anybody has questions, please feel free to interrupt, unmute yourself is probably the best way at this point to communicate with me. But the point of the poll is to show that you all are, for the most part, more community-minded. You go into this because of concerns about environment, building community. These are very different from the reasons of the consumer survey, which is more individualistic minded. People care about their own health, about getting delicious food. And I think coming from those different sides, producers caring more about the community, eaters caring more about the individualistic benefits of local food systems, that's fine. But as we're going to explore later in that presentation, this leads to a conflicting set of assumptions. So the reasons why people leave community-supported agriculture programs, and let me try to hop into Rachel, can you actually get me back on the on the screen share, please?
Yeah. Do you want to stop sharing the poll results?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So the poll's off and we can see your screen, so you're good to go.
Great.
And Jesse, if there are any questions that come up in the chat, I can see the chat, so I'm happy to feed those to you as well.
Okay, all right, thank you. Reason why people leave community-supported agriculture. The leading reason is supermarket withdrawal, and these are complaints about wrong vegetables, limited seasons. But even though this is the leading cause, it still only accounts for a quarter of CSA departures. And in fact, more optimistically, when we add up the reasons that don't indicate flaws in the CSA system, like moving, changing farms, an overabundance of food, and also being more hyperlocal and people having their own garden, that already counts for a half of people leaving a particular CSA program. 11% complain about the quality of the food, which survey authors here attribute to farmer inexperience. 8% say they leave because of the lack of time. And then at dead last, only 6% say they leave a CSA program because it is not affordable. But I want to dive more into this issue of supermarket withdrawal because it really illustrates those three take-A principles I talked about earlier. With supermarket withdrawal, customer complaints under this category is the result of what happens when there is no shared understanding about each other's desires. That's the principle of mutual understanding, where there is no appreciation for how CSA prices are determined, principle of mutual concession, and in the absence of this understanding, there is no customer commitment to accept produce regardless of the condition. That's the final take-A principle I discussed, the principle of accepting a produce. And the problem is especially clear in this quote from a disgruntled customer experiencing supermarket withdrawal. He said, "The vegetables were too weird. We ended up replacing things we didn't like by shopping at the farmer's market. Some people no doubt love purple potatoes, mystery greens, and guess a squash as a staple. We weren't expecting this. We won't participate next year. It's another one of those theoretically good ideas, but it suited the farmer's convenience, not ours." This quote demonstrates consumer ignorance about how to use weird vegetables, how CSAs work, and your hard work. So the foundation of community investment and CSAs starts with educating the community. And this can start with a verbal discussion about the nature of community agriculture, risks, risk spreading, what we talked about earlier. But verbal discussion is not enough. And that's because when we humans hear information, we recall only about 10% 3 days later. But this horrendous recall rate could be supplemented by reinforcing verbal discussion, talking to people with other mediums of information. So for example, you can provide recipes coupled with pictures to show how to use weird vegetables. You can provide samples to show how delicious these weird vegetables can taste. And finally, we can talk about price transparency. This is the principle of accepting the produce, that with, again, to draw on that traditional investing as an analogy, public companies are often required to share their financials with investors. And this has the effect of giving investors the confidence they need to understand the value of what they're buying. And that same benefit can be used for CSAs, of actually disclosing the true costs of the producer to justify the price of CSAs. And part of that is the risk as well, but it doesn't have to stop with financials. It may be beneficial to share hours, how much time you spend harvesting, weeding, etc. These are essentially the labor costs that also need to be factored in the transparency model. A CSA program shared this information at the Southern Sustainable Agriculture Working Group in Little Rock. I was greatly impressed by the amount of work that goes into farming, and I'm confident that other consumers will be as well. As I talked about earlier, the more sources of information, of different medium of communication we have, the better to boost the recall rate. Contracts are a way of reinforcing information. They do provide educational benefit. It's one thing to talk about something, but it's another to reinforce that when someone is having to read that and knowing that they're going to affix their signature on that page. Contracts aren't just about education, they also memorialize information. So even if for those bits of facts about the nuances of crop failure or the probability of crop loss we talked about, or the fact that they are partly on the hook for crop failure, if they forget that information, there's a record of it that they can look back on, or that the grower can look back on to understand and to remember what exactly was agreed to months after the transaction, after the verbal agreement itself. Third function of contracts, they mold expectations. We know this is a problem because, as we talked about earlier, customers and producers have a very different sets of motivations that gets them to enter into this type of transaction. And it came to a head in that quote of a disgruntled customer I quoted, who said flat out, "We weren't expecting this." And I doubt that disgruntled customer is the only person. And the reason I doubt that is because of Amazon, where this has become the sort of default consumer transaction experience that we expect, we expect to see an image on our computer screen of exactly what a product is going to look like. We expect that identical practical replica of that product to get delivered to us within a certain period of time, guaranteed. And if it doesn't happen, we probably would expect some kind of refund from the seller. This is, in fact, the typical consumer type transaction, the consumer type mindset. But a contract, at the very beginning, it sends this sort of signal that we aren't entering into a general typical consumer transaction. It's more of an investment that needs the formalities of a contract to signify that it is actually an investment. Finally, contracts can actually build relationships between community members, community eaters, and growers, because contracts can contain provisions to agree to agree. I've heard of people, not lawyers, who actually like to have written provisions in a contract, even when they're not enforceable. And this is because they want to build relationships. They want a provision that says, if we don't agree on something, let's sit down and talk about it first before going off to court right off the bat. So, contrary to popular belief, written contracts can actually avoid lawyers, like me. And I'm not saying this in a self-deprecating way. I like my doctor, but I'm not going to binge on ice cream to visit her more. Contracts don't compel a resolution. These types of provisions don't guarantee it's all going to end up friendly, but at least they require some good faith negotiation off the bat. A reason why I've dedicated a good portion of this talk to talking about the benefits of written contracts and CSA type arrangements is that 1/3 of farms are hesitant about putting the terms of CSA agreements in writing for fear of appearing overly litigious or lawyerly. So I want to just take a moment to pause to see if anybody has concerns about using written agreements in community-supported agriculture programs. Sounds like there is nothing, so I will move on.
Well, Jesse, I do want to jump in. If folks have concerns, you're welcome to drop those in the chat so we can maybe surface them. And Jesse, I'm actually going to walk you through how you can see the chat because there's some good stuff happening in there. So if you look at the top of your screen where your Zoom toolbar is, you should see a drop-down menu that says More. And when you click on that, you should see an option to click on your chat.
Oh. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so there's been some good ideas that people have thrown out, and there's been one sort of big overarching question that asks, what is the best way to get the customer their benefits in a way that does not hinder daily production? And it sounds like you've touched on some of that, but just wanted to surface that that's in the chat. And then, yeah, just folks throwing out some really interesting ideas about how to avoid this sort of element of surprise when folks get things in their box that are unfamiliar to them.
Yeah, and I guess to answer that question, and I think I have about 18 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so to answer that question, I think it really should start with, you know, people probably have learned a little bit about you through perhaps some kind of farmer's market, or they're reaching out to you. It should start off, I think, as a conversation where you can talk about crop failure, about how to make sustainable agriculture economically sustainable. And I think it should start off as that kind of dialogue about what the community member can do to get more involved. And I think CSA programs are one of the easiest way for eaters who want to do more than just eat and go to their farmer's market. So I think as a starting point, CSAs aren't necessarily for everybody. They're really more for those who are already, at least morally and emotionally, I guess, invested in the idea of having stronger local food systems. And I'm going to talk in a moment about what actually goes into the community CSA agreement. But I hope that answers, as I'm reading the chat for the past half hour, I hope that answers everybody's questions. And prepaid cards, that is an interesting idea. The one qualm I would have about that, though, is when we're talking about CSAs, I use the word investment a bunch. And that shouldn't be confused with this legal term, securities, which have a lot of regulation, whether you're talking about, especially when you cross state lines and then you're getting involved in federal regulations, think SEC, but even within state lines, if we're talking about securities, and that's where you put in a certain amount of money with the idea of getting even a larger amount of money back, that is what a security is. And there is an exception under a US Supreme Court case for commodities. So it's fine to give more food as a reward for that money investment. But when we're talking about gift cards and you're entitled to, say, $100 for putting in a $50 share of CSA, that's entering into a gray area. I'm not saying it's upright illegal or wrong, but it is entering into a bit of a gray area. State regulations actually aren't that difficult, but if you are set on the idea of prepaid cards, you probably should give me a call to talk more about the legalities of everything. I'm going to return now to this issue of what actually goes into community supported agriculture agreements. Obviously, the price, the statement of the shares or the anticipated yield that the consumer is going to get, the risk of crop failure, and this is where you can get more conversational, educational. It doesn't just have to be legalistic, there is a risk of crop failure. Have in writing a description in your own words what crop failure is, what causes it, and a clear explanation as to how it is not a matter of the grower's fault or the grower's convenience. It is a matter of nature. The contract, therefore, should talk about risk sharing, that because there's these forces completely outside your control, it is absolutely helpful to have community members share in that risk, and that they are getting a discount for that risk. There should be a provision in the contract that the sales are final, and there should also be some description about the pickup procedure or other logistical details. And let me just make sure I've, as I said, I think you know your eaters. I think that there are some eaters where that is true, where if we're talking about just a casual person who shows up at the farmer's market, it kind of uninitiated as to the qualms of the grower, that's true. They probably aren't the best candidate to take on the risk. But I think there are other people, I mean, just to take the most dedicated example, when I'm talking about core group members, those are the people who are really invested in what you're doing and what the operation is doing. And I'm going to take a break, I think, from the official presentation because these questions are really interesting.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen while we're taking a break from the presentation, just so we can all Great, there we go. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I have to confess, this is my first presentation I am making on Zoom.
You're doing great.
Well, so there's, and I guess just to provide an illustration, refund policy can be negotiated to provide an illustration of what I'm talking about as far as this idea of risk sharing. There is a farm, a community farm, a nonprofit right out here in Tampa called Sweetwater. And it actually had members agree to take risks. And it actually did offer a refund. Then it asked, even though we're offering a refund, would you want to apply this to future CSA seasons, or would you be willing to just donate it? And there were some that asked for a refund. There are others that were happy to help out the farm financially. And this same program actually asked for just money loans and let community members set the interest rates. Some, including large organizations, had an interest rate of 0. The average interest rate was around 2%, which was still well below the market average. So to answer your question about refunds and who is willing to share risk, I think you're probably in the best position to assess the individual. But I think as a general matter, if we're talking about refunds, especially refunds in the event of crop failure, then we're not really talking about community-supported agriculture. We're talking about a type of guarantee that's really closer to the typical consumer transaction, like a farmer's market, where if you don't give food, then you need to give a refund. It's fine to do that, and I think for a lot of people, that's what they need, as you suggested, to get them to buy your produce. But there are others who are kind of, if we think about consumer engagement as a funnel, especially in light of the pandemic, on the one end, there are people who shop at massive grocery stores that don't want to have anything to do with local food systems. Those people are completely inaccessible. There are people, because of the pandemic, who are getting more aware of the need to have vibrant local food systems that may have been in the group of, I am fine shopping at Publix, I don't want to bother doing anything else but Publix. So there is a spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, opposite of Publix, are those who really want, are I think in a lot of senses similar to you as far as what has driven you to become food entrepreneurs. And I saw this morning there are nonprofits, I think, that may be represented here that are really interested in making our local food system stronger. And those are the types of people that CSAs are for. So I think it's important to present CSAs as an option for those who are more dedicated. If you know your consumer isn't interested, if you know, as to borrow the words from the disgruntled customer, that you're dealing with someone who gets upset when they see purple potatoes, then you should not even bother asking them about community-supported agriculture. But if you see a community member who just kind of shows up at the farmer's market each time, wondering more about what you do, what keeps you up at night, and that sort of thing, I would think they are excellent candidates for CSAs. And if you're not sure, I think it's beneficial to provide options, and that's a good way of actually illustrating what community members are getting. You can say, for example, that buying this amount of produce, if you want a refund policy, you're going to pay X amount of money for it. If you're willing to take in the risk and you understand the risk of crop failure, then you're going to get this discount for enrolling in the CSA program. So I hope that answers everybody's questions. There are a lot of chats. I think the only other issue I was going to talk about, there's actually, because I've touched on some of the points in my later presentation. The other exception I will make, I guess, as far as who are good candidates and who are not good candidates for CSA programs. There is a program known as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. This is a federally funded program. And part of the condition of this, because federal programs have conditions, I think that this is a reasonable one, that if they are using federal dollars, as SNAP recipients do, they're not in a position to take that kind of risk. Under federal regulations, they can't. If you're dealing with a recipient under the SNAP program, they need to get food if they're using tokens. There is no way around that. And I think there's good reason for that, but that is an example of why it is important to use other types of CSA products. The other, I guess, qualifying caveat I would have here is I've talked before about the funnel from a marketing perspective. I also don't think that CSAs should necessarily be a standalone product as far as risk management. Yes, it helps manage the risk of crop failure, but there are other great programs out there. One of them is, for example, the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Plan. Again, this is a federal program. It's heavily subsidized, actually, by the federal government. I'm sorry. And it's easier than ever to qualify for this program that rewards diversified farming because of the 2018 Farm Bill. So conventional insurance policies should also be considered. Just be sure you understand how they work. A lot of, can the person from Galaxy, I just want to understand that question better. You can unmute yourself just because I want to hear about how this may help solve the case of traveling CSA members. I think I'm actually running out of time as
I can comment about it.
I'm sorry?
I can comment about it. It's Carl at Kaikai. I've been running a CSA since 2007. So that happens all the time. You get snowbirds that come down to Florida and they're here, they prepay for like 17 weeks and, oh, well, now we got to leave town and go to Thanksgiving, or we got to go snow skiing for a couple weeks or whatever. They want to reschedule. We actually had to write our own, basically our own software, our own database system to manage rescheduling, because it just is it's a fact of running a CSA. Everybody wants to reschedule. It's guaranteed. Or they bought too much, or the box was too full and they want a week off to eat it. I mean, there's a million reasons. So you have to be flexible.
Yeah.
Sorry, just one quick thing. It looks like our friend with the Galaxy device has been able to unmute themselves, so I'd love to hear more from them. And yeah, we have about 3 more minutes, so maybe we can wrap up with this particular question. And Jesse, is it okay if we share your slides with folks when we send a follow-up email?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I have a more extensive, let me just actually go back to screen share. If you can put me on screen share. I have a link I think Rachel can probably send to everyone that has a more extensive set of slides. And of course, you can reach out to me if you have any additional questions. My email and I think my contact information, I think Rachel may be able to follow up in a follow-up email. I think farm cards and CSAs are a great idea as long as it's spelled out in the contract and as long as there's some provision for the event. It sounds like what happens when people have more than what they bargained for because of some unexpected travel. And it's really up to you how you want to handle that, whether they get a discount, and as part of that discount, they're essentially taking the risk for their own travel plans, or whether you want to have some type of hybrid refund policy. CSAs, I think, are more of a framework. There's lots of room for flexibility. There's lots of room for different pricing options in terms of what is eligible for a refund and what is not. So as I said, this is more of a framework. I think I am going to wrap up now. So thank you so much for attending my presentation. And I really enjoyed talking with you about how CSA can engage consumers and help manage risk.